1 o'clock. My name is Toriso Maloka, and we are going on with the conversation. We've just had quite a bit we were exchanging just ideas and thoughts and thinking around different discussions that were happening. And I encourage everyone to call in. I really do. To just share your thoughts and where you feel calling us. Let's do exactly that. We're having open and honest conversations, aren't we, that impact all of us on a daily basis. So call us on 0861 987 000 on Twitter or on @PowerFM987. Hashtag Powerzone. You can tag myself on @Toriso Maloka. Now, our next segment is it's very fascinating. We've got Kumo Zingitwa and Natasha Saungweni, who are then two budding bloggers and vloggers, really, that are on a journey of discovery, and they just, want to take others along with them as they unpack the social and cultural, economic, and economic topics in the African context. And if you might recall that in the past couple of days, really, we've really been touching on the conversation around issues that are occurring within Africa, as well as cultural aspects of everything that is happening within an African context, to the point where we tried, in our last book review, then brought it to almost a South African context of trying to understand and define Black consciousness as of, the understanding and the words and the write-ups of the likes of Unkgopotse Abraham Piro, as well as Steve Bantu Biko. Now, as Africans, really, our identify lies in our history, all cultures, and, a lot of us experience this when we go home and they share where we come from, where we go, who are our ancestors, and what's our lineage looking like. And our identity really lies in our geographical locations, and as well as the values that hold our group of people together. I mean, some of us hold close to sentiments to either the places that we come from or the places that we're told our ancestors come from. And you'll be told for it. This is where great-great-grandfather and there's a sense of sort of homeness that you feel sometimes, or that some of us feel when we visit those places. And really today we just unpack what the African identity is, as well as what it means to be African. And really above and beyond that, we unpack whether Africa could be a country, right? And we've got Kumo Zingitwa and Natasha Saungweni, who are going to unpack this conversation for us. Kumo and Natasha, good morning.
Hi, Toriso. Hi, thank you for having us.
Hi, Toriso.
Thank you guys so much for waking up at the crack of dawn to have this discussion with us.
It's okay. It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you for being here with us. Actually, I'm going to start with Kumo. Kumo, if you can just take us through you guys' conceptual thinking around the idea of, I almost want to say making, bringing. Oh, no, I don't want to say making African fashionable, because it almost goes against one of the sentences in your articles. But what brings about the idea of creating awareness of the African social and cultural and economic topics?
So we're both living in a space as two Black women who are millennials, and we found ourselves finding it very difficult to familiarize with the environment that we're in sometimes. We're getting into conversations and feel like maybe we have less information than our peers about, Pan-Africanism and the state of the economics and African business. But we weren't finding information that we thought was relatable. But we also had a strong liking or a passion for being African, and it's something that we were very passionate about exploring. And so we wanted to marry those two roles, in which we can marry information and make it very engaging for people who also don't understand maybe certain topics or aspects, and so that we can unpack them for each other in a more relatable manner, but also have very meaningful and important conversations that are necessary for taking us forward as a country and a continent.
No, definitely. And Natasha, you guys have, sort of put together what you call Izwelami.
Yeah.
Which is a blog, right? And is also on social media platforms. What is the idea around Izwelami?
So I think, just to echo what Kumo said, when we started on this journey, right, we said, okay, we want to create, a space that speaks to the world, because Izwelami is Zulu for, my world. So it's just to create that space where, we create content that speaks to, the daily issues that people face as modern Africans, and to say that, is it a relevant topic for us to actually go down and, uncover, because we're now living in the world of globalization and, integration issues and policies that are coming about. So what impact does that have on us as Africans, young Africans living on the continent, considering that you are now living, for example, in this age of social media, where everyone wants to be doing, the latest trend setting idea and stuff. So what impact does that have on us as the generation that's supposed to take the continent forward? So it's just a space for us to have like non-intimidating chats and conversation to understand how we can help each other move forward.
Sure. No, definitely. And I'm really a subscriber to that notion. We speak often in some of our social circles about how a lot of us are really coming out of our shells, or our sort of our Western carved shells now, to say that I actually want to know what it means to be African, right? Mm-hmm. And you guys think about a quintessential African, right? Mm-hmm. If you can paint this picture for me, please, especially or particularly from the view of a young African. Both of you ladies are young ladies, mm-hmm. And you encounter the different issues as well as different privileges really that come with being African on a daily basis. When you talk about a quintessential African, what are some of the sort of hitting the checkers or blocks that you sort of look at to say, this qualifies as a criteria for a quintessential African?
Yeah. So I think the crucial starting point is to understand what it means to be African, right? Yeah. And if this definition actually resonates with anyone. And we also wanted to say, look, the quintessential African for us when we move in spaces is someone who's able to tie a doek in a certain way, wears fashion, African prints and stuff. And we're saying, if we look at our closet, we probably have 2 or 3 items that we wear to weddings, and over and above that we wear almost like Western type of fashion. So does that make us not the quintessential African? In terms of languages, if I can speak for myself, because I was born in Zimbabwe, right? And then I moved to SA, and now I can kind of forge my way around Zulu and some Sotho there, right? Does that make me less African if I can't speak my home language, but I am able to speak other languages, but not so well, So there are a lot of issues, I think, that surround this. You need to be able to do certain things for you to belong, okay? So we said, okay, so if we're going on this journey, we need to unpack a lot of issues before we get into specific topics. So we wanted to understand, okay, so what is this African identity? That people need to subscribe to for them to feel African? Is it something that we can actually quantify, or is it just qualitative data that we can actually put together that people can say, oh, okay, that actually makes sense, I also feel that way, and I identify with this supposed African identity? And I think that's a good starting point for us to move forward, to say, are we the quintessential African, and is there such a person?
Kumo, I'm picking up from just some of the points that Natasha is making, right? Based on a quintessential African, right? And I just want to understand. So Natasha, being born in Zimbabwe and having to come to South Africa, you can understand that there's some cultural complexities that he may encounter here and there, right? Mm-hmm. And you find that quite a number of us, a lot of the times, are judged by the silliest things, including things like accent, especially those of us that then live in urban South Africa or urban Africa in general, right? Mm-hmm. Do you feel that there's a conversation of there's one that's more African than the other, or there's a sense or feeling of insecurity sometimes, of feeling that someone is more African than the other because they have qualities that society would deem them to be far more African than the other?
Definitely. So I mean, in the second article that we wrote, we made the notion about it's now cool to be African, right? And I think we especially when we're going around in our social settings, I think there's always this typical, let's say, ideal African man who looks like he knows everything that is to know about being African. He has the scruffy looking afro, always wearing like an African print t-shirt, and really always has this robust language when it comes to politics and economics, right? And sometimes you get into those settings and you get to a point where you feel like actually it seems as if there are people who are more African than I am, who probably speak more African languages than I speak, who read more African books than I read, and therefore I probably feel less African than they are because, people would probably not associate me as being black enough. Maybe because of your mannerisms or the way you speak or just the way that you were raised. And so that is what we're questioning about. What exactly is this African identity? And is it simply just pinpointed to the way that you speak and the way that you dress? Yeah.
So
And
I'm
why?
going to take it to physical features as well as, choices in physical feature. And I'm looking particularly at hair, right?
Yes.
We've recently had the rain, we've recently crowned the new Miss South Africa. And Uzozi Bini, and she's a beautiful young lady with a beautiful haircut, right?
Yeah.
And, you had a lot of sentiments and celebratory points about this is a truly African feature, right? I mean, I can tell you now, I have short hair myself. Probably as short, if not shorter, than the Zibinis, right? But there's a number of sentiments that didn't sit well with me with that conversation to say that are we really attaching the sort of the quality of an African woman based on her hairstyle choice?
Yeah.
Because it's really a choice. I could have my short hair today and tomorrow morning decide to go by wig yak.
Yeah.
And it builds on so there was a conversation that was happening. I'm sure you can still follow it. It's #BlackWomanOWN, right? It was a conversation that was happening with the Oprah Winfrey Network. And I'd like both of you to build up for me, please, from there's two quotes that I'm seeing here. So one says that no other race or gender gets their hair talked about more than black women, right? That's the first quote. The second one is the diminution of anyone's black womanhood because of the choices made about their hair as a reflection of societal pressures that tell us that we don't have the right to choose. Can both of you please just, break this for me in terms of your observations of Africanness and especially modern day Africanness?
Sure.
So I think, those are definitely problematic statements, right, that we have coming out. And I think, there is definitely a place in which we need to start appreciating the history. And I think, if people that have read the article will see that we make mention that we need to understand each other's history. And I think, the idea of saying there was a time when, people existed on this continent before colonial rule, right? But what we know is almost as if from when the colonial rule started and up until present day. And we don't almost appreciate the indigenous knowledge systems that existed and values, and way of life that existed before that colonial rule. And I think, the reason why people are now saying, the natural hair movement and all that stuff is because I think too many times, the African, and I'm saying it in air quotes, the African aesthetic has been pinned against Eurocentric type of looks and values. You need to have the straight hair to be beautiful. You need to be lighter to be beautiful. If you're not a yellow bone, you can't be appreciated for what it is that you're bringing to the table. You're also considered not to be as educated or, intellectual because of the skin tone, right? And that all has to do with the colonial rule that was set, okay? And, for us to come to a point where it's not right to look down on, on certain groups of women because of how they look or how they choose to wear their hair. But I think, we also need to be comfortable to say that we also need to come to a space where we appreciate those non-Eurocentric type of looks because people choose to wear their hair a certain way. You know, if you want to wear it straight, if you want to wear it wavy, weave, scopo, G-scope, right? That's what they call it. Then it's up to you, right? It's all about personal preferences. And I think, you know, we should have both sides of the conversation, but in a healthy, constructive way, not to look down on the other for whatever choices that they decide to make. Appreciating, you know, each side of the conversation.
No, definitely. Kumo, your take?
You know what? I always love the phrase that we are all problematic in our own ways, right? And I think being black is always a journey of us learning things, relearning and unlearning certain behaviors. So I mean, the conversation about black women and our hair is, I think, a very, very deeply entrenched conversation that needs, like, a round table where we're all sitting together and we can have honest conversations, maybe about why we feel maybe it's possibly so inclined not to have our own hair. And those are problems possibly that were built in us generations beyond us, in our parents, in our parents' parents, and things that we have to psychologically work through, because I mean, you can't get over the mental impact of 400 years of colonization. But with that said, black women are probably the most policed individuals in the world, and we cannot continue to excuse the idea that yes, maybe there are certain aspects in our life that are claimed to wanting to be closer to whiteness and then using that as an excuse to police black women. That is complete nonsense. And women should be allowed, apparently I'm not allowed to say that, and women should be allowed to do as they please with their hair, with their looks. And I don't believe that however you choose to wear your hair makes you less African than the other, and which goes back to the identity aspect, that, you know, the way you choose to wear your hair doesn't make you more or less African than the next woman. It is just a preference of hair.
I'm seeing a couple of pointers that I really want to go into in one of your articles. Could Africa be a country? How to create a unified continent for all, right? And that is on the Izwe Lami blog. But before we go there, from both of you once again, right? Let's step into the conversation of language, right? And the importance of language as a central point of. No, actually, let me remove as a central point, then you guys will then sort of unpack this for me as to whether or not you see it as a central point of Africanness. So we have a gazillion languages between, you know, all people of the African community, right? And we've got similarities in our languages, and some writers or some academians have then gone to sort of discuss the notion of Proto-Bantu as well as a Proto-Bantu dictionary. With our adoption of English, as well as English being now our everyday use between quite a lot of us, actually, and I'm just thinking of in my own social circles, actually. Do you feel that we're losing the plot on language? Do you feel that we're losing a very important part of our core Africanness, which is then language, or which I'm seeing as language, rather?
Sure. I believe language is a very important aspect. I think in terms especially in terms of education. I remember in my first year in varsity, we had this English class where we were encouraged to write essays, and there was this guy who was brilliant in mathematics, and we used to do mathematics, and he was brilliant, but he was dismally failing on the language aspect of it, and therefore he ended up failing it. But, you know, I can imagine if he was allowed to possibly study in his own language, and what an impact that would have made for him in his first year, having not failed that subject. So there are, I think, a lot of things that are intertwined into our language. And I think it's very important that we delve into maybe using more of our own languages in business acumen, because that's where it begins, right? The conversation, how we speak. And I think the problem is that maybe we don't even have the dictionary reference for these languages, because if maybe we were to start to say, let's just completely speak Sesotho in our offices, what is an Excel spreadsheet in Sesotho? you know. And so maybe those are things that we need to date back into our history. And maybe it changes the aspect of our education, our educational system, and how language is taught in schools. Yeah, Natasha, what do you think?
Yeah, I think for me, I have a different take on the importance of language only because
Yeah.
of, how I grew up, right? So having to live in like in Pumalanga where they spoke one language, then having to move to the northwest, it was me just trying to fight for survival in terms of, being accepted into society. And definitely the language aspect was a big thing, right? In hindsight, when I think about it now, I had to work almost twice as hard to try and fit in than I would have potentially in a different type of setting.
Yeah.
So language definitely is important. But for me personally, like now as an adult, I see my sister and the way she's raising her kids. They go to schools where they're taught in English, so private schools, and then they have Afrikaans and they have the option to choose Zulu, right? But I don't think that makes them less entrenched in the culture of being Zimbabwean, right, or being African. I think language is just one single aspect of it, but in terms of trying to encapsulate what this Africanness is, it's a melting pot of various things. And if we only stick to one aspect of language, then we're actually going to detract and be very superficial in how we can actually move forward as a people. So language for me is neither here nor there. I understand its full importance for sure, but I don't think that should be the limiting or the factor that should stop us from moving forward as a people.
So, and I mean, I'm picking up from what you both have said, right? And just sort of relaying it to an extract that you have in your article here, which was then said by or written by Koltiambe Zeleza, in the Inventions of African Identities and Languages, which is a paper that was published in 2006. And what I'm picking up is that in many instances, our diversity. So in South Africa, the coat of arms is written it's in Barking. Why am I forgetting this? Okay, but anyway, so our coat of arms reads Ike Karake, which means Barking, unite in diversity, right? But when we take it outside of the borders of South Africa, it sounds as though our diversity, right, is the same thing that is not necessarily unifying us. And this is what I'm picking up from Natasha's experience. And, quite a number of people I can think of actually that moved from either Zimbabwe or Zambia or and moved to South Africa and lived in an area or a city where only one language, for example, was spoken. And I'm just going to go into this part today. It is that Africa is exceedingly difficult to define, which makes many academic and popular discourses of African identities and languages quite problematic. The idea of Africa is a complex one with multiple genealogies and meanings, so that extrapolations of African culture identify or nationality in the singular or plural in exploration of what makes Africa African, right? And I'm going to go right till the end. Describing and defining Africa and old tropes prefixed by its problematic commandments entails engaging discourses about Africa, the paradigms and the politics through which the idea of Africa has been constructed, consumed, and sometimes celebrated and condemned. And I'm just sort of relaying this to the experience that Natasha experienced. And Akuma, you probably have similar interactions as well. I mean, if maybe as a young girl you travel to Durban. I know my biggest problem has always been was KZN. At some point, Kimotwana.
Yeah, no.
And at some point, I have never been exposed to Sizulu.
Sure.
And my first exposure to it was, then having my Africanness or my blackness really being sort of wiped away, my black card being taken away from me because I could not understand Sizulu at some point in life.
Yeah, I think with Natasha's point, because I grew up in a very Sotho area. I grew up in Vaal, and in Vaal they speak Sesotho. And my mother's side of the family, most of them from her paternal side speak Setswana. So I'd go there and I'd be around people who speak Setswana. My father's side of the family speak isiZulu. So when I'm with my father's family, I'd have to learn isiZulu. I think everyone in my family probably knew I was a mess at languages because I was always trying to master all of them at the same time and end up speaking all of them at the same time. And so I don't think I've really truly mastered any one of those languages even now. And I think I've developed quite a few insecurities about it. And that's why I'm always afraid to tell people, I'm Zulu because, now I must speak KZN Sizulu and it's rough. But so I understand that, like the language is we are a melting pot, and I don't know, maybe we shouldn't be extracting so much importance to it,
Yeah.
if we're able to have our lived experiences every day.
Yeah. And I think, to the point that you raised earlier on around, could that diversity that we have be the factor that's stopping us from actually moving forward? And I think, what's really important is acceptance, and you can't accept that which you don't know or that which you don't understand. So, I think the onus is on us as people, if we want to move forward as a collective, is to really understand, where each one is coming from. And, if I reflect back to when I first moved to Potch, and I was at Potch Girls High, and I was in boarding school, and I started, boarding school very late. I think I was in grade 11 when I went there. And, when you're sitting outside the hostel, the girls would be chatting, and, you're more drawn to people of color, right? For me, I was more drawn to people of color. And I would be sitting there, and they would be having a fat chat in Tswana, or was it Sotho? And I'm just like, oh my gosh, I don't understand. And then there would only be one ally in the group, on my side, who would say, guys, Natasha doesn't understand. And you know what they said to me? They said, well, if you want to hang out with us, you're going to have to learn the language. And I was like, oh my gosh, I cannot not have friends. So it took me about 6 months just to get the basics right. And, imagine going through that as someone just to get social acceptance, like by force. It's such a horrible lived experience, to be honest.
And I mean, you know what's sad? Some of us have some sort of an innate concern to travel other parts of the world in fear of language, right? That, guys, I probably can't even greet in Mandarin, right? Or I can do the very basics, yet we create that same sense of insecurity for other people within our surroundings.
Yes.
Call us on 0861-987-000. We have Natasha Sankweme on the line, as well as Kumo Zingidwa, and we're just talking, Africanness and what it means, especially in modern day. Now, Natasha and Kumo, in your article on the blog, right, you talk to three pillars specifically that sort of, what does it say here? It says, let's break some of these multiple data points that make up Africa into constructs that can lead us to this hopefully single African identity definition. And there's three pillars. I'm going to pick up from them, please. I just want to take a call, and then, because these are quite lengthy points, and I want us to really just dive into them. We've got Donald from Centurion.
Yes, it's Donald here. How are you, ladies?
Good, thanks, Senior Donald.
Good, thanks.
Good, thank you. Listen, all of you ladies, and I'm happy as African ladies. I'm not even sure that this is a relevant question or opinion, but
please pose.
Yeah. I just want to ask, like most of African women, how do you feel? Most of you wear like to beautify yourself, or for you to assume that you look good is for you to be wearing these wigs and this artificial hair that represents Western people or white people. So when you are wearing a wig and you are with a white woman, maybe you are among the white women or something like that, do you not feel like how can that white woman will say or you trying to look like her? Like in quite honestly, I'll be honest, and I'm not trying to undermine you ladies or belittle you or something like that, but why do you think you're more beautiful? Or don't you think the fellow white women is looking at you and saying, look, she wants to be like me. She wants to, she's, I don't know, but if you get my question, how do you guys feel in that way? And especially when you're among white people, white women, don't you feel like they undermine you for trying to be like them? With the wigs, with those artificial hairs, how do you feel about particularly them?
And Donald, I mean, you know what? I hear your question is coming across as very apologetic, right? Which I really wanted to zoom into the fact that this is a question that's being asked by people, including ladies themselves, and not. So I just want us to just relay the answers of this. Just take into consideration there are people with a legit concern around this, such as Donald and many other people.
Okay. Donald, that's actually quite a fascinating viewpoint and question. Like, I've never thought about it before, okay? And I think, you know, there are people that do certain things because of insecurities or because of confidence or whatever reasons, right? Whatever the reason is the reason. And for me personally, I wear wigs maybe 3 weeks in a month, right? And I do it because it makes me feel beautiful. It has nothing to do with the next person. I don't really care about the comments that come from either, other African women or from white women. For me, it's a personal choice and it's what I want to do. So it's the same as, if we were to ask you, what is that one apparel that you wear because, that thing, that confidence, like you feel like you can conquer the world when you wear that specific thing, and if you're able to point it out, it's the same with us, right? So however I choose to wear my hair, it's about me and it's a personal choice and nothing to do with the next person. Whatever opinions that the next person has is really, it's up to them to have them, right? I don't really give a concern around any of those things. It's about me and my personal choice. So no, I don't feel like that personally.
I also think, Donald, it's important that when we ask something, we find out first, what is the purpose of me asking this question, right? So once you have gathered this information, once you have the data that 10 women wear wigs because, I don't know, they want to be white women, what are you going to do with this information? Why is it important to you? What are the implications it has for improving people's lives? And if essentially you're going to do nothing with this information, if it doesn't implicate or build or improve people's lives economically, then essentially it's not an important question to ask. And which is essentially the problem about policing women's bodies and the choices they make about what they want to do with their hair. Because essentially most of the time we really don't care. Where we wake up in the morning and we just want to look really, really good. So, but it is essentially probably a problem for other people. And maybe once you ask that question, you should identify why it is important for you to accumulate this information and what you're going to do with it.
Thank you, Lily, for answering that. And Donald, I mean, I sort of alluded to earlier on that. I remember reading an article by the late Bapuma Sekela would not even greet a lady that's in a wig or that's in a weave, right? And I mean, that's someone that you look up to. And at the same time, if you hold the opinion or if you hold the take that, don't judge me according to my hair or I'm not my hair. I think India Ari had a song around this that, I can be bold today, can be wigful tomorrow, I can be short haired. It does not necessarily change the person who I am. But there's a lot of people with this question really. We've got Katlego from Sebokeng.
Yes, ma'am. Hi.
Good, thanks. How are you, Katlego?
Not too bad. Thanks for asking. Look, I've been listening to the ladies quite attentively because I'm very much interested, passionate about issues of African identity.
Yeah.
I think, if you look at the history of Pan-Africanism, historically how it's developed, the idea of African identity had everything to do with connection to the African continent and understanding that the history of the African people. So I think to a huge extent I haven't heard an in-depth discussion ever since the interview started around the relationship that African people have with the continent and the history of that continent. So issues of memory are important. For me, if you speak up, and I heard one lady saying that language is not that important, but if you read the Kenyan author, novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he speaks about language, the preservation and development of African language, because it holds memory. And without memory, then we cannot know who we are. The cultural values that make us distinctively African are in our language, and we must find ways of developing our languages so that they are spoken more often, and we restore and revive who we are. So I don't think that language is a periphery issue. I think it's a central issue. In fact, it's about cultural supremacy. The fact that I cannot speak scientifically in my native language is an indication of how much cultural subjugation continues to exist in modern society today. So the questions have not fundamentally changed. For 60 years ago, the questions remain the same. So I think we don't have to reinvent the wheel by trying to revise Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism, it doesn't need to be revised. I think the works of those who came before remain relevant today if we take them for what they are. The problem is when we begin to revise a philosophy that was scientific and had a lot of scholarly work in it. That's just my 2 cents worth.
Thank you, Katlego. And just before Katlego, the ladies come back to you, I'm going to take one more call, but I need you to keep listening, please, because there's my next question then was going to stem into a bit of in-depth. You mentioned that you're missing sort of like an in-depth discussion, right, where the ladies just break into 3 stems where they break multiple data points really that make up Africa into constructs. And I hope you can still contribute in this, where they speak about a history that unites, connecting through shared values as well as common future goals. And they will sort of dive deep into that. But just before that, I need to take another call for you, please. We've got Godfrey from Kempton Park.
Hi,
Hi, Godfrey. Good, thanks. How are you?
Well, so the ladies there.
Godfrey, can I please ask you to speak up?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, the issue that I want to speak about, I think one of the ladies there spoke about it. This issue of language, I don't believe that there's a language which is more important than the other. It's all about survival. You see, when you go to an area and you realize that without speaking the language that is spoken in the area, then you are forced to speak whatever language that they speak there for you to adapt. It's all about that. At the end of the day, language is just there to communicate, for people to understand each other. It's not about other things of importance. It's just that people want to feel important, that, this is my language that we are speaking of. But I think that is secondary. What is primary is that the language is for communication. So we communicate so that we can understand each other.
Okay. Thank Godfrey. Sorry.
I don't think I'm done.
Oh, no, sorry, sir. I thought I'm sorry.
Yes. So like now, in Africa, there is this concept of saying we want to introduce the Swahili as an African language that is widely spoken in Africa and all that. The question is, what is it that Swahili is going to offer to all Africans or people who are coming to Africa? What is it that is going to offer? Is it going to be able to influence Germany or England to want to speak that Swahili. If then it's like that, then let's go for it. But to me, I can see that it's only about that people want to say that, no, this is my language, and then it is now an international language, and they feel important. But it's not supposed to be like that. It's supposed to be about communicating with each other so that we understand each other. That's my view.
Thank you, Godfrey. And ladies, just before you go into both the points of language preservation, as raised by both Katlego as well as Godfrey. Godfrey, and I hope you're still listening as well. I mean, we spoke about earlier about not necessarily dismissing the views, not the views, but the sentiments and the feelings that are held by people. Right? I personally of the notion that if I have a child one day, go with Setswana, or they will learn Setswana, right, and they will speak it fluently, and they will learn other languages as well, because there's just certain rituals for me that that only make sense in my mother tongue, right? For example, the concept of church, right? Church for me makes so much sense. Yes, it's not too. I will go to an English sort of preaching church, but there's just something in mother tongue, and the celebration of Kiswahili then being recognized as the fourth language within the Pacific region. That also sort of brings the preservation of culture, I think, for many people who have had to adopt French and, other sort of languages that came as a form of colonization, particularly in African countries. Natasha and Kuma, can we pick up from the comments from Katlego as well as Godfrey, please?
Okay, cool. So, I mean, in terms of going into the deeper points, I think we said that we will get to that particular section, which, what he's looking for.
Yeah.
But, for me, again, I can only speak from lived experiences. And I'm not dismissing the importance of language. Not at all, right? I mean, I would also want my future kids to speak Shona. But what happens if I marry, let's say, a Zulu person and they're staying in South Africa? At what point will my kids then have that experience to then speak Shona? I feel so deeply about it, but I don't think that should make or break the relationship that I would have, with my kids, or what my kids to have as a lived experience. Otherwise, I'll just ship them back to Zim, right? To live an experience that I also don't want for them economically. So I understand the value of language, right? Because the moment we just say that, it is the most key and critical point, right? Then we're then excluding people that are Pan-Africanists but reside in the diaspora and are potentially second, third generation of Africans that have moved in search of a so-called better life, right? So do we then exclude those people from the conversation because they don't speak Kiswahili, or they don't speak Zulu or Shona or whatever the language is? Is that fair enough for them to not participate in the economic, frameworks that we put together as a continent? I think those are relevant questions that we need to ask each other, to say, are we not just leaving out people outside of this framework because of language?
Yeah. I also disagree with Katlego's comment to saying we shouldn't try to reinvent the wheel, and because Pan-African ideologies are pre-existing. So, times are continuously changing, and things need to be reviewed and questioned and criticized. And we need to identify whether they are still relevant within this current framework and within the times that we're living now. And Pan-African ideologies are quite important, and probably most of our workings, without whether we know it or not, are probably based on a lot of the ideologies that they have. But I don't think you should go through life not questioning anything and criticizing it to identify whether it's still relevant for the space and the environment that you live in now. And him simply saying that, nullifying Natasha's experience is rejecting the experience of so many African people who've had to leave their homes and learn other languages in terms of survival, who've looked for better experiences for their families and for their lives. That's simply...
No, absolutely. Absolutely. All points really taken, and this is I think you also allude to it in your article, and many writers really to the concept of or the conversation of our diversity, because I think a lot of what makes our interactions quite complex is our diversity. But I need you ladies to also touch up on the because we've touched up on a lot of Katafa's points, right?
Yeah.
In terms of Godfrey almost saying that and Godfrey, if I'm incorrect here, please, Papa, you're more than welcome to come back and say so his notion is that the conversation of language is about importance. And someone sort of deeming my language is more important than the other. In terms of the preservation of language, because he says he's also neither here or there. Just speak whatever that brings that brings sort of sense to the table. As well as another point that he alluded to is that what influence does it have to someone living outside of the continent of Africa for us here? For example, Kiswahili being implemented as an actual official language.
So,
if we have any takes on that.
So I found something that, so I'm just tying this, there's something that Katla said that, the importance of preserving language is that it carries memory. And I found that very profound, actually, which I found a lot of truth to it. But then my next question would be, 6 generations later, how do you tap into that memory when no one understands that language? So, I mean, those are questions that we continuously have to question. I mean, he's right. If we go into maybe a township in Pretoria, half of the people there speak half Setswana, Sepedi, mixed with a variation of languages, right? And those are because people have migrated to a certain area and lived in that urban space and have had to adapt to the languages that are being spoken there. So how do we tap into exploring that language and how we can connect it to the African identity and tying it into learnings, into education, into adapting our present day experiences to future experiences and things that could help us in the future. So how do we tie in that environment and that micro level, the languages that the people speak there, into their education, into their business acumen, into the work that they do, and then exploring it into a macro, because we're not living in an environment where we're all speaking the same language, we all understand the same language.
No, I have to be granted. We've got Unmobile from Midrand.
Hello.
Morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm great, and yourself?
Great, thanks.
I just wanted to weigh in on the conversation of, identity and having, for us, me as being a black man in corporate, right, it's always been a fascination of mine, going back to the issue of hair amongst black guys, right? So the standard corporate man always, is presented as a man who never used to have any hair, wild hair to no beard. And it just got me thinking along the lines, because, as you sit around in boardrooms or in training centers with other people, and you look at how Indian people and white people style their hair in very different ways, and they have their hair, whereas opposed to most black guys, it was always just plain cut, and I used to be part of that school as well, and it almost made me want to go back into the history and look at why is it that we as black men don't keep our hair, And my research led me to the people of Fiji, who have these men who have beautiful hair. They even have native Afro combs, and different notions and understanding that our natural hair is an antenna, and beautiful descriptions that, there's a universe in our Afro. And it's always now, I was speaking to a friend of mine who's Zimbabwean, who says that in Zimbabwe it's very different how you present a corporate image as a black man. You're not allowed to just come in with an Afro. And for me, I struggled to fit into corporate when I first wanted to grow my hair and cut it in a particular way, or grow my beard. I think it comes into that whole space of previously we were never included into society in a particular way based on the way we look, and how there's a certain way that as an educated or a type of black man you're expected to look, And throughout time, things have changed, we've seen in schools, and then you look back at how back in school we weren't allowed to wear our hair in a certain way. Even having an Afro in my high school was a thing that was greatly policed by the school policies, And I think a lot of the colonial history that we have had a lot to do with suppressing our identity, and it's a struggle for us to re-emerge into the world and try and figure out to say, no, but looking like this is normal. For me, I always say, when I used to start growing my hair, I'm like, no, but this is how I look. This is naturally me. If you as a white person can naturally come to work with your hair the way it is, I should naturally be able to come to work the way that I look, So it's been, I think there's a lot of lost pieces in it, whether it's about the language conversation, when I feel like nature is beautiful in its diversity, but everything about Africa seems that our diversity was used to divide and conquer us.
Yeah, no, and here's the thing about corporate, right? And we've had this conversation a number of times as well, to say that some of us almost feel as though you need to wear yourself off yourself in order to efficiently and effectively participate in a corporate environment.
Yeah.
And Nobile raises some of those concerns, really, to say, I remember, who was this? Someone was saying that, a friend of mine was saying that she wanted to wear her Zulu skirt, right, as well as a closed top and beads to her on a normal day. And I think she had a steer car on that day. She's like, but people will talk. And you look at other African countries where going to work, like Bobo and Ghana, Nigeria, going to work at Ankara, it's not unfamiliar at all. In fact, it's almost unfamiliar to come without one, right? And that is maybe then more of a South African context. And Nobile mentioned earlier that he has a friend who says that in Zimbabwe it's almost frowned upon as well to present yourself in what we would regard as African apparel. Do you ladies, sort of, in your observations and your studies and your writing, and maybe your personal lived experiences as well, the sense of having to wear ourselves off ourselves to participate in corporate?
I always say that, and it might be very controversial, that I don't think corporate spaces were built for black bodies. They are completely unwelcoming of our presence and our mannerisms, and so I generally don't think they were built for us, and therefore they will not be meant to adapt for us. And it is generally up to for us as individuals to always push the status quo in that environment. And so, I mean, be a black man who grows his hair unapologetically and doesn't comb it, because that doesn't remove you in any way from doing your job. And so unfortunately those are continuous battles that we fight internally, I think, in our own experiences as well. And
I think for me, just to echo everything that Kumo said, and just to draw on my personal experiences in corporate, and I'm now getting to a point where I have to tread this fine line of being this angry black woman all the time who always has to call out her colleagues in a PC manner, right? And this is across the racial lines. So if I were to give you an example, so I'm currently transitioning my hair from relaxed to natural hair, right? And it's a process, and it looks a mess, right? But I do my best, especially the times when I'm wearing it and I'm going to work. And I was wearing my hair to work, and a black colleague of mine, male, said to me, "Natasha, are you having a bad hair day?" And I'm like, "Why would you say that?" And he's like, "Your hair looks so unkempt." And I'm like, did I not comb it right? And he's like, "Yeah, I just prefer you when you're wearing your wig or when you're in braids." And I could not.
A preference on me.
So I could not understand the audacity, right? Firstly, to come and tell me how I should look. And then secondly, coming from a black man who has a black wife who has natural hair, right? So it's like double standards, and it could be because of the environment. And then the second one is, when I wear dukes, and I do it almost as rebellion, right? Because I'm trying to find someone who is going to say anything about my look and how I look like I'm going to a funeral, and it's really not the look that, you know, suits me. And I'm always trying to call them out, you know, to say, you know, guys, I think we actually need diversity programs in the workplace. No matter how cool your team says they are, they have these deeply entrenched feelings, you know, about what corporate wear should be across the racial lines. And just to speak to that colonial rule, right? And I think it really plays an important part, and which is why programs like, you know, the diversity training is really important. I mean, we see these things on American television where people are out saying that, you know what, people were diversity hires and they had to introduce programs so that people could be fully integrated, so that the other colleagues could understand why someone was hired, a person of color. And I think, you know, the true state, the same is true even within the African context, that Kumo could come and judge me for the choices I make, but she's also a young black female, you know? So there's a lot of complexity that goes into the mindset shifting and the mindset change, because, you know, even when we in corporate see another young man maybe with dreadlocks, we're like, yeah, he's never going to get to senior management. We know that, you know, just because of his hair. We know nothing about his skills. We know nothing about his acumen, his knowledge, but we, by virtue of us looking at his style and wearing dreads, we already know that, my friend, this is where you end.
Yeah, I mean, I think our idea of excellence looks like a tall British white man, right? And which is an idea that we continuously have to work ourselves out of. That's why we are all problematic, because it's true. You will see a man with dreadlocks at work and think, I don't understand why his hair looks like that. Yeah. So we're continuously problematic because I truly believe the space wasn't meant for us. And maybe we need, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've experienced some interesting, not personally, but I've seen them happen around me. For example, a lady with a ZCC badge and a long skirt and a duke seemed to be inferior.
Yes, I saw that.
Without her even having said anything.
Yeah.
Like, she is just sitting on a table. We're in a meeting, and she's being seen as inferior. You know, and you pick her up by the aftermath commentary that is being made by other colleagues. And it's like, but just take me through your thinking. What makes you think that? Especially because we're sitting at a table where every single person around this table has presented qualification, skill set, as well as experience that proves them enough to be here. You know, and there's a conversation of interviews as well, that in order for me to crack it into certain, you know, top corporates in South Africa, I need to present myself in a particular way in an interview, where I remember I had an afro in high school, and it was quite big, right? And I took a gap year. And I went for an interview for promotions, right? Because my mom was just like, well, kind of get alternative accommodation or make a plan. This gap year plan is not going to work out at some point. And she relaxed my afro the morning of the interview. You know, I never thought about it at that point, right? But when the movement of I am not my hair, Nyako Girls in particular, that came about, I wanted to go back to that day and ask her, why do you feel that I look neater in this? And this is the same person that encouraged me to grow an afro, because relaxer creams, I'm quite sensitive to them.
Yeah.
So it's really, I mean, it's deeply entrenched.
It is.
It's stuff that we grew up with. It's an unlearning process. And I often say that unlearning is much deeper and far more complex than learning.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think
I
think it happened to me in an interview I went to months ago. I was contemplating whether to wear my wig or just go with my short hair. And I ended up wearing my wig, because it's like, those poor white people, they can't be exposed to this. Let me.
And like, you know, I think we also need to get to a space where we start to address microaggressions, because, you know, my gosh, I could write a book about the experiences that I have at work, you know, where it's like, it's sly commentary, where I'm like, do you realize how offensive you're actually being? You know, you think you're being cute and you're being funny, but you're actually being offensive. So, I think it's something that we actually need to be quite open and honest about, and bring to the fore to say, guys, this is the playing field, and this is what we need to understand about the cultures, again, which is why it's so important to have the conversations, especially in these spaces, like Kumo saying, that they were never designed for us. We have to fit into those spaces in some shape or form, but we have to be them and not ourselves.
Absolutely. We have Tabani from Pretoria. Tabani.
Tawani.
Koponto again. Tabani.
Tawani, yeah.
Oh, Tabani.
Yes, meaning planting a seed.
Okay, please spell it for me, Taban.
It's T-A-V-H-A-N-I.
Yeah. Oh, Tabani.
Jalani in Tonga.
Okay, no, I've got it. I wanted to get the pronunciation right, because I was pronouncing it. I could feel that it's not being right.
Okay, it's Tawani. Hey, this is a really sensitive issue. While you were talking about, my mom just commented like, hey, listen to Power FM.
Hello, Mommy.
Hi, Mommy.
What she was trying to tell me now, she was saying to me, what topic is sharp, but the language that they're communicating, it's wrong, because some of us, so the only language that we captured that was dominant at that time, it was African, right? So after that generation, you guys, we switched from Africans to the English, American English, you understand? Which is, you have never even once tried to even give your language a chance. That's why you even feel incorporated, because I think it was week before, like 3 weeks back, right? I quit my job just because of this language thing. So my manager, in most cases, wouldn't allow us to talk in Vernac, right? So the manager and the assistant manager were Afrikaner, right? So we would talk in Vernac and be told not to talk in Vernac. After that, when you talk in your Vernac, they give you a warning. But when they want to talk about you guys, they speak in Afrikaans. And some of us, we act as like we don't hear Afrikaans, but we hear a bit of Afrikaans. So, in what I'm trying to say, Corey, I was listening to one of your guests there. He was saying, having to wear Meridia Watuwasu. It's a personal, what do you call this? A personal
choice.
Yeah, I understand. So, a choice. So, Horori, each and everyone, if you can check, especially our generation, like the 21st century generation, right? Everyone will say, "Ki choice ada," or "Ki choice ada" to speak in English. I guess that's where you feel like you need to stand as an African to defend yourself against your fellow African brothers or fellow African sisters, because I've realized that white people worship us. Like, if you can go to market, like your social market and everything, you can see how black people, when they're together, they're very beautiful. And even when Babuakaswana or Ruwasut or when you can even realize that white people live on like that. But just because we don't give them chance, right? We want to always be copycat of what people are doing, right? That's why everything when it's being said, in terms of culture, your belonging and everything, you refer it to economically, it doesn't sound right. Because you won't allow it. And that's why we can never invent anything. Because remember, if whenever when I try to invent something, when I go to white people, so that they can understand what I can. So, everything that I need to learn about me, right? So, how am I going to invent something about our African cultures if everything that we do is about white people? I don't know if you get my point.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really a continent-wide problem, right, Tawani? And thank you to Alamama for raising this as well. And I'm going to give the ladies a chance to feedback on that, because I'm not sure if you've watched the movie The Boy That Harnessed the Wind.
Yeah.
the real story behind it is that he actually couldn't speak English, right? And he invented, but again, like windmill.
The windmill,
To
yes.
try and create water or a method of access to water for the community, right? And his product went abroad, right? And that's not to say hore, there are people who might feel inhibited by the use of Setswana, Sizulu, or whatever the case may be, in trying to put their inventions out there. There are people that struggle with English or Afrikaans or whatever that has been decided to be a common language between people. But I think at the same time, let's credit Tabane hore, if you and I start speaking ka Setswana, as it is right now, we have already excluded masses of people out of our conversation.
Definitely.
You know, contextually speaking, in a particular geographic, Pretoria, yes, you know, we can have the argument just Setswana le Sepedi, or in Soweto, Sesotho, Sizulu, or which, depending on the section, right? And I think a lot of us really, especially those of us that were brought into the English-speaking society in forms of, inverted commas, better education, a lot of us are really now coming out to say, actually, or you know, can I? But at the same time, I do not want to. What Natasha went through in high school, where you'll find a couple of girls speaking Setswana and not including her in the conversation. In the context of a particular geographic location, yes, maybe the conversation can be posed to that of nature. But if we're saying Horkamo Africa in particular, if I go to Tanzania right now, and I will hear bits of Kiswahili, but I will miss massive parts of the conversation and definitely feel excluded. Tawani? Okay, that was Tawani from Pretoria. Thank you so much, Tawani and Mama. Mama, thank you for waking up Tawani to listen. Natasha and Kumo.
Yes.
Your feedback on the commentary?
Sure. You know what? I can't disagree with him. All of the points he made were very powerful, especially in the aspect of saying that, if he were to, he can't invent, actually that even hurt me. He says he can't invent something, because if you were to invent something, I suppose in order to get capital or funding for this project, you have to present it in front of people, and therefore you have to be able to speak English. And I think that is a problem. I think that's why it is important to create these microorganisms, right, in which we are able to accommodate the space and the environment that we live in, and maybe move away from traditional norms of doing things, maybe from traditional norms of funding, and going back to more community-based ways of funding, going back to our people that we can actually say, dumelang, nekenale, honale selo se so se ke se irang, and I wanted to find out if you would be interested in exploring and helping me grow this. This is how it's going to help our community of Sebokeng. This is how it's going to change people's lives. Ne ke kopa di 50 randa from every household, and this is how much you will get back. About that type of situation. But I think it really goes back to economically just giving back people their dignity, because it literally it shows me how entrenched the language thing is to our dignity.
Sure.
Yeah.
Natasha?
I think from my side, if it wasn't because of my tenacity to learn languages in my formative years, I would not have understood this entire conversation, right? So for me, again, I'm not downplaying the importance of language, and I think it's something that it's clearly becoming a bigger conversation, and something that maybe we need to unpack on our next segment, right?
Yeah.
The importance of this language thing, but again, we should see how we use it in the spaces that we're in. We will always be in toxic environments, be it at work, be it in our own communities, right? Because of how we function and the stories we tell ourselves, and as a collective, to say that people like us do things like that, like this way, and by virtue of you not being able to do it the way we do it, you get excluded. But then what benefit does that then have in terms of progressing forward as a society? And I really get the concerns that, he raised, and, that his mother raised, to say that the language that they're speaking. But again, you also then said that the moment we start speaking in Sotho, then we would have excluded a majority of the people from the conversation. Then people can't contribute to it, right? So do we not then start to say, okay, we need to get to a common understanding to say, you know, when we want to do certain things, these particular languages or mannerisms or whatever it is are acceptable, right? Because we want to look at the benefits beyond the communication. So if you have an invention like the movie that you mentioned, such a beautiful movie, right? It goes beyond that. It's now about survival for the village to be able to get water, because I mean, if that hadn't happened, they probably would have starved to death, right? And you had the multinational corporations that were coming in and buying land. But because he was able to come up with that technology, regardless of the language that he spoke, you know, there was survival for the people. And I think we need to start looking beyond, you know, the borders and the parameters of I don't want to say trivial things, but matters that will limit us from moving forward as a continent, because then we are then excluding people that want to be, you know, actively participants in terms of, you know, moving the continent forward. We then exclude the rest of the continent. We exclude people that are living in the diaspora because they're 3-4 generations removed from the continent. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah, I think there's a balance there.
Ladies, we spoke about earlier, you know, the breaking down of, and I think this is probably going to be in conclusion, because I suppose both of you are going to deep dive into these 3 segments that you've presented, right? So we're speaking about breaking some of the multiple data points that make up Africa into constructs that can lead us to this hopefully single African identity definition, or the attractive force rather, right? No, actually, no, this is not our last point. We need to talk about the coolness of Africa, or the coolness that is Africa. And this one is really just to go back to Katlaho's concern. Katlaho from Sebokeng was saying that we're not diving deep into the conversation. So you guys have identified 3 segments, right? Or factors, really, to say that in order for us to create, to effectively talk about Africa as one, or a single African identity, we need to understand the history that unites. We need to connect through shared values as well as common future goals. Can we please go through each of those points?
Yeah, for sure. So the first point around the history that unites, right? And we say in that article that, look, the history is ugly. It's traumatic. And, you know, the different generations have a different type of experience. And our experience is as a result of those experiences, right? So we are almost like the benefactors of those experiences. But we need to understand that, you know, everywhere around the 54 states that we have on the African continent, everyone has their own story to tell, right? And for us to understand where we are at today as a people, we need to understand where we're coming from. So that will help us understand the choices that we make, you know, the policies that are being created in order to enable the people today, or policies that don't exist today, you know, that should be in place. And I think, you know, understanding that history as a starting point is the most crucial piece of it, because then we are able to understand how we can then move forward, especially given, you know, like certain policies of integration that come up in terms of the African Union and all that stuff. It's all about connecting, you know, these little pieces of everyone's history to say, okay, so now we're here. Now what?
I also think it's I think it's important. So Natasha touched on something earlier in the conversation that, I mean, there's really no well, there probably is information and books to read on who we were as a continent before colonization, right? And I think it's a mental block, because maybe we don't realize who we were, because we know the story of being conquered, we know the story of being raped, we know the story of being violated, but we don't know who we were before that, before the weakness, before the violence, before the struggle and the war. Who were we as African people, right? So that we can build on that and say, yes, maybe this was our history at that time. And maybe not even higher level conversation, because people will say, but the books are out there, but the articles are out there, the papers have been published. But that is a higher conversation, because how do we filter down this information to abantu abahlala elokishini, who don't
Yeah.
typically read published articles in a journal, right? And who typically need to identify with this African identity, who need to acknowledge this history so that they can get dignity, so that they can resonate with who they are as African people, so they can walk around with the same confidence that we walk around with, saying, I am an African woman, right? But how do we connect that confidence for them when they have tied in their history and their lived experiences with suffering, and those of their forefathers, and also after that they just generally have no experience or story of excellence. So how do we tie those two up? So I think it's very important for us to learn our history, and also to even break down literally what those years of colonization has done to African people at a mental level, right? And how that mental or cognitive thinking is filtered down from each generation, breaking down those things so that people can understand maybe why certain things are filtered down generationally, and how to break those curses for communities, for countries, for provinces, or whatever. So yeah, understanding our history, understanding each other's history as even countries, understanding the history of Zimbabwe, so you can understand why people literally cross borders to come, to come live in your country. Why we have undocumented immigrants. Understanding that history, and maybe will get us closer to a path where we understand each other's current experiences, and where we can understand the need to cohabitate and share our resources.
No, absolutely. I mean, it creates sort of a platform for cohesive conversations, as well as for us as the African people. Let's talk about the commercialization of the African, the coolness of Africa. If you go into Instagram, you have Wogebi Union now, we'll take pictures, Katuku or beads. You have the sort of, I wasn't a fan of, and I just need to disclaim that, Wakanda, because I felt there was a whole lot of fiction and not the truth told about the actual village that the story sort of narrated from. Let's just dive into that in terms of the commercialization or the sudden coolness of Africa, as well as to what extent do we really display this coolness? Are we just looking at attire, or are we looking at the deep-rooted lineage as well as the core of being an African?
It's really something that I'm also very passionate about, because like the Wakanda story, I mean, it was a great movie, right? Because it was the first time we got to see people of color dominating the big screen.
Yeah.
But the storyline in itself had so many flaws, right? But now the coolness, we see Samuel L. Jackson, getting citizenship in an African country because, he's traced his roots back. And I think that's fantastic, right? But when we start looking at organizations, I think it was it Louis Vuitton or was it Gucci, that then, made fortunes off borrowed, and I'm saying borrowed very lightly, aesthetics of the Basotho blanket. Yeah. I mean, that's cultural appropriation, right? And you're not even giving it credit. What we don't want is for Africa to be cool because someone outside of Africa, in terms of belonging, etc., is now saying that it's cool, right? It's the same as when the Kardashians started rocking cornrows. Suddenly, everyone thought cornrows were cool, and that had nothing to do with whether it was a black person or an Indian person. Suddenly, cultural appropriation is a problem, and I think we need to address those things for what they are. I think it's about time that we started putting Africa in the spotlight that it actually deserves, outside of it being this dark continent or poverty-stricken, continent. Yes, those things are true. There is a lot of poverty on the continent. And I think it is time that, we started to tell our own stories. And sometimes we need allies. But it's just, how do we navigate the stories that, that we're actually trying to tell of Africa being cool? It should be stories that we have ourselves. Because a lot of conversations are happening outside of Africa, for Africa, and decisions are being made. Even if we look at like the SDGs, where they're saying we need to have certain levels of people living beyond the poverty line. But I mean, that doesn't make sense for the African continent, because the SDGs say that, we need to reduce poverty by 2030. And the way that the continent is growing economically and in terms of the population, we are only potentially able to get to like a 10% population living under the poverty line by 2045. That's a 15-year difference. But people are having conversations and are making decisions for us outside of the continent. We need allies for sure, but we need to be the ones that are at the forefront of this conversation, not the others. And I think that's just like my view on it.
I also find it particularly annoying because it's the coolness and then after that nothing, right? So the American celebrities will wear their dukes and it will be a celebration of Africanness, and Samuel L. Jackson will get his citizenship, but he's not going to move his family there so that they can be like, oh, come, so that you can experience the true African life, and so we can reclaim our identity and know what it truly feels like to be African. And so I just continuously feel like we'll be made a mockery of, unless your intention is to actually make a difference or involve yourself actively in things that are happening in Africa. And there's no reason why we should be excited about all of that.
No, absolutely. And I'm really excited about all your work. I'm really excited because I understand that this is work that you do outside of your core 9 to 5.
Yeah.
And I'm really excited about the awareness that you go out and create. So Izwelami, where can we access Izwelami?
So we have an Instagram page and a Twitter page. We have an Instagram page. It's called @Izwelami. And then our Twitter page, same @Izwelami _@Izwelami. Yes, and that we're launching a YouTube channel.
Yeah.
So
Yay! So we're going to have our first full-length video out on YouTube, and you can get us at Izwelami as well. So it's just at Izwelami across all the social media platforms, excluding Facebook, because who's on Facebook these days? And then if you want to read our articles, you can search for us by name on Medium. That's where we have our written version of the space, and then we will have the video version on YouTube and on Instagram.
That is rather Kumo Zingito and Natasha Sangwemin, who are the creative heads behind Izwelami, and Izwelami is a space where where they interrogate the issues that impact the modern day African. I hope that we talk to these ladies again. I hope that they invite us to their conversations and